The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 3 feet in front of me. My fingers were numb, clutching the thin fabric of my coat as I stood at the bus stop on Maple Street, watching the flakes pile up on my worn sneakers. The wind cut through me like a knife, and I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, wondering how I'd ended up here. At 72 years old, standing in a blizzard, waiting for public transportation because my own daughter couldn't spare 20 minutes to drive me to my doctor's appointment. The irony wasn't lost on me, not even a little bit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I watched as car after car drove past, their headlights cutting through the storm, passengers warm and safe inside. Each vehicle reminded me of the conversation I'd had with Rebecca just 3 hours earlier, her voice sharp with irritation when I'd asked for a ride. "Mom, you're perfectly capable of taking the bus. I can't just drop everything whenever you need something. Some of us have real responsibilities." Real responsibilities. As if 70 years of building a life, raising children, and creating something meaningful from nothing wasn't real enough for her. But standing there in that storm, shivering and forgotten, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. Sometimes the people closest to us see us the least clearly. Sometimes they mistake our kindness for weakness, our humility for helplessness. And sometimes, just sometimes, they forget that the quiet strength they've always taken for granted might surprise them in ways they never imagined. The bus finally arrived, 15 minutes late, its brakes hissing as it struggled through the snow. The driver, a young man with kind eyes, looked genuinely concerned as I climbed the steps, my arthritic hands gripping the rail for support. "You sure you should be out in this weather, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gentle with worry. I smiled at him, the first genuine smile I'd managed all day. "Sometimes you don't have much choice, son." As I made my way to an empty seat near the middle of the bus, I caught snippets of conversations around me. A college student was complaining about her professor. A man in a business suit was arguing with someone on his phone about quarterly reports. An elderly gentleman near the front was telling another passenger about his grandchildren. Life continuing, ordinary and precious, while outside the storm raged on. I settled into the worn fabric seat and looked out the window at the city I'd called home for 5 decades. Pittsburgh had changed so much since I'd first arrived here as a young woman with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart full of determination. The steel mills were gone now, replaced by tech companies and medical centers. The neighborhoods had evolved, some thriving, others struggling. But the bones of the city remained the same, sturdy and resilient, much like the people who'd built their lives here. My reflection stared back at me from the bus window, and I saw what everyone else saw. A small, gray-haired woman in a modest coat, with wire-rimmed glasses and sensible shoes. Someone's grandmother. Maybe someone's burden. Certainly not someone who commanded respect or attention. Not someone whose opinion mattered in boardrooms, or whose decisions affected thousands of people's daily lives. That was exactly how I'd always preferred it. The appointment with Dr. Morrison went as expected. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, which he attributed to stress. "Are you getting enough support at home, Eleanor?" he asked, his pen poised over my chart. "It's important for someone your age to have help with daily activities." I almost laughed. Support at home. If only he knew that Rebecca saw my presence in her life as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. That my son Michael lived 3 states away and called twice a month out of duty rather than love. That my youngest Sarah was so busy climbing the corporate ladder that she'd forgotten I existed except when she needed something. "I manage just fine, doctor," I told him, because it was true. I'd been managing just fine for longer than most. People realized. The return trip was worse than the morning journey. The snow had intensified, and the wind had picked up, creating near whiteout conditions. The same bus driver was still on duty, and he recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Patterson, you're heading home in this mess? Don't you have family who could pick you up?" "Family has other priorities," I said simply, not wanting to burden this kind young man with my personal troubles. He frowned, clearly troubled by the idea of me navigating the storm alone. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll make sure the bus stops right at your corner, even if it's not an official stop. Can't have you walking any farther than necessary in this weather." His kindness touched me deeply. Here was a stranger showing me more consideration than my own daughter had. "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than he could possibly know. "That's very thoughtful." As the bus made its way through the snowy streets, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Rebecca that morning. It hadn't started with the bus ride request. It had started with something much more significant, something that had been building for months. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," she'd said, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed, looking around my tidy home with obvious disapproval. "This house is too big for you. You're getting older, and it's not safe for you to be rattling around in here by yourself." The house she was referring to was the modest two-story colonial I'd bought 40 years ago, when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges and the price was something a single mother could manage. I'd raised 3 children in this house, celebrated countless birthdays and holidays within its walls, and watched my family grow and change from the kitchen window that overlooked the backyard where they'd played. "I'm perfectly safe here, Rebecca," I'd replied, continuing to wash the breakfast dishes. "I've been taking care of myself in this house longer than you've been alive." "That's exactly my point, Mom. You're 72. What happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you can't maintain this place anymore? We need to start looking at assisted living facilities." Assisted living facilities. The words had hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Rebecca wasn't talking about my safety or my well-being. She was talking about convenience. Her convenience. The inconvenience of having a mother who still lived independently, who still had opinions and preferences, and a life of her own. "I'm not ready for that conversation," I'd said firmly. "Well, you need to get ready," Rebecca had snapped back, "because the rest of us can't keep worrying about you all the time. We have our own lives, our own families to think about." That's when I'd asked for the ride to the doctor's office. That's when she'd told me to take the bus. That's when the storm outside had seemed less cold than the storm inside my own family. The bus lurched slightly as it navigated a particularly icy patch of road, and I gripped the seat in front of me to steady myself. An older woman across the aisle caught my eye and smiled sympathetically. "Terrible weather to be out and about," she said. "Yes, it is," I agreed. "But sometimes we don't have much choice in the matter." She nodded knowingly. "I hear that. My daughter was supposed to pick me up from my physical therapy appointment, but she called at the last minute. Something about her son's soccer practice being more important than my recovery from hip surgery." We shared a look of understanding. 2 women who'd discovered that the children they'd sacrificed everything for had grown into adults who saw those sacrifices as obligations rather than gifts. It was a common story, more common than anyone wanted to admit. "The thing is," the woman continued, lowering her voice, "they don't see us anymore. Not really. They see the gray hair and the wrinkles, and they think that's all we are. They forget we were young once, that we built lives and careers and dreams just like they're doing now." She was right, of course. They did forget. Rebecca had no idea that before she was born, I'd been Eleanor Chen, the woman who'd started with nothing and built something remarkable. She saw only Eleanor Patterson, the mother who'd packed her lunches and driven her to soccer practice and helped with homework. The grandmother who babysat her children and cooked holiday dinners and sent birthday cards that arrived precisely on time. She had no idea who I really was, what I'd really accomplished, what I'd sacrificed to give her the comfortable life she now took for granted. The bus pulled to a stop near downtown. and several passengers got off, their heads bent against the wind as they hurried toward warm buildings. I watched them go and thought about all the times I'd made this same journey over the years, but under very different circumstances. Board meetings, contract negotiations, crisis management sessions. Times when my presence in those downtown buildings had meant the difference between success and failure for thousands of people. But that was a long time ago, and I'd made my choice to step back, to let others take the credit and the spotlight while I enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of knowing what I'd built. It had seemed like the right decision then. I'd raised my children, ensured their futures, and created something that would outlast me. I'd thought that would be enough. Now, sitting on a bus in a blizzard because my own daughter couldn't be bothered to drive me to a medical appointment, I was beginning to wonder if I'd been too generous with my anonymity, too willing to let others forget who I really was. The woman across the aisle gathered her things as we approached her stop. Before leaving, she turned back to me one more time. "You take care of yourself, dear," she said. "And remember, we're tougher than they think we are." I smiled and nodded, but her words stayed with me long after she disappeared into the storm. We are tougher than they think. The question was whether it was time to remind them of that fact. The bus finally reached my neighborhood, and true to his word, the driver stopped right at my corner instead of making me walk the extra 2 blocks to the official stop. "You sure you'll be okay getting home from here?" he asked as I prepared to disembark. "I'll be fine," I assured him. "Thank you for your kindness. Take care, Mrs. Patterson. Hope this storm passes soon." As I stepped off the bus into the swirling snow, I realized he was the only person who'd shown genuine concern for my well-being all day. A stranger who'd gone out of his way to help an elderly passenger navigate a dangerous situation. It said something about the world we lived in, and it said something about my family. The walk to my front door was treacherous, but I made it safely, my key turning easily in the lock I'd turned thousands of times before. Inside, the house was warm and quiet, filled with the familiar scents of the lavender sachets I kept in the linen closets and the faint aroma of the soup I'd made the day before. I hung up my damp coat and sat down in my favorite armchair, the one by the window that looked out over the street. The storm was getting worse, and I could see neighbors hurrying past, bundled against the cold. Cars moved slowly, their drivers cautious on the slippery roads. My phone rang, and I saw Rebecca's name on the caller ID. For a moment I considered not answering, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice artificially bright. "How did your appointment go?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "It went fine," I replied evenly. "Dr. Morrison says I'm in good health for someone my age." "That's good. Listen, I wanted to apologize about this morning. I know I was a bit short with you about the ride situation. It's just that David had that important presentation at work, and I had to take the kids to 3 different activities. And sometimes it feels like I'm being pulled in a dozen directions at once." Her apology sounded rehearsed, like something she'd practiced in the car. I wondered if her husband had prompted her to call, or if her own conscience had finally kicked in. "I understand you're busy, Rebecca," I said. "I managed just fine on my own." "I know you did. You always do. That's what I love about you, Mom. You're so independent, so capable. Most women your age would be completely helpless without their families constantly taking care of them. Independent, capable. The words stung because I knew she meant them as compliments, but they felt more like excuses. Reasons why she could continue to take me for granted without feeling guilty about it. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "when you think about my life, what do you see?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when you picture who I am, what comes to mind?" She was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. "Well, you're my mom. You're a wonderful grandmother. You're someone who's always been there for all of us, who's always put family first. You're kind and generous, and—" She trailed off, perhaps realizing that her description sounded more like a eulogy than a portrait of a living, breathing person with her own identity and accomplishments. "Is that all?" I asked gently. "Mom, I don't understand what you're getting at." "I'm getting at the fact that there might be parts of my life, parts of who I am, that you've never thought to ask about." Another long pause. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of impatience that she was trying, not very successfully, to hide. "Mom, if this is about the assisted living thing again, we really do need to have that conversation soon. I know you don't want to hear it, but you're not getting any younger, and we need to plan for the future." The future. As if my present was already over, as if my life was nothing more than a problem to be managed rather than a story still being written. "I'll talk to you later, Rebecca," I said. "I'm tired from my adventure in the storm today." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house and thought about the choices I'd made over the years. The decision to step back from the public eye, the choice to let others take credit for what I'd built, the willingness to become invisible in order to protect what mattered most to me. At the time, those choices had seemed wise, even necessary. But now I wondered if I'd protected my family and my legacy so well that I'd erased myself in the process. If I'd been so successful at hiding who I really was that even my own children had forgotten. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside my warm house, surrounded by the memories and mementos of a life well lived, I felt something stirring that I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of quiet determination, a recognition that some truths were too important to keep hidden forever. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer. There were things that needed to be discussed, papers that needed to be reviewed, decisions that needed to be made. Not because I was planning to die anytime soon, but because I was finally ready to start living as myself again. Rebecca wanted to talk about my future. She wanted to make plans and arrangements and decisions about what was best for me. But she was about to discover that some conversations required knowing who you were really talking to. And she had no idea who I really was. The morning after the blizzard dawned crisp and clear, with that particular quality of light that only comes after a heavy snowfall. Everything looked different, transformed, as if the world had been given a fresh start overnight. I stood at my kitchen window, sipping my coffee and watching the neighborhood slowly come to life as people dug out their cars and cleared their sidewalks. My phone had been ringing since 7 in the morning. Rebecca, checking to make sure I'd survived the night without freezing to death or falling down the stairs. Michael, calling from Denver because Rebecca had apparently contacted him in a panic about my dangerous bus adventure. Sarah, who somehow found time between meetings to express her concern about my reckless behavior in taking public transportation during a storm. None of them had asked how I'd felt about being abandoned to face that storm alone. None of them had inquired about my actual well-being beyond the physical. They were treating the situation like a crisis they needed to manage rather than a symptom of something much deeper that was wrong with our family. I let their calls go to voicemail and instead picked up my address book, the old leather-bound one I'd carried for decades. The pages were soft with age, filled with names and numbers accumulated over a lifetime of relationships, both personal and professional. Some entries were crossed out, people who'd moved on or passed away. Others had multiple updates. Phone numbers changed and changed again as people shifted through different phases of their lives. I found the number I was looking for and dialed, carefully, my arthritic fingers taking their time with each digit. "Martinez and Associates," came the crisp voice of a receptionist. "How may I help you?" "This is Eleanor Patterson. I'd like to speak with Carmen Martinez, please." "One moment, Mrs. Patterson." The hold music was some generic classical piece, probably meant to convey sophistication and trustworthiness. I'd always found lawyer office music amusing, as if Beethoven could somehow make legal fees more palatable. "Eleanor," Carmen's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" Carmen Martinez had been my attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my professional history, and more importantly, she was someone I trusted completely. "I'm well, Carmen, but I think it's time we had a conversation about some changes I'd like to make." "Changes to your will?" "Changes to everything. Can you fit me in this week?" There was a pause, and I could hear Carmen flipping through what I assumed was her appointment book. "How about Thursday afternoon? Say, 2 o'clock? "Perfect. And Carmen, I want to review all the corporate paperwork as well. Everything we've kept sealed." Another pause. Longer this time. Carmen understood the significance of what I was asking. "Eleanor, are you sure about this? We've worked very hard to maintain your privacy all these years." "I'm sure. It's time." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my own filing cabinet, the one tucked away in the corner of my study that my children had never bothered to examine. Inside were folders that told a story very different from the one my family knew about me. Documents that proved I was far from the helpless elderly woman they seemed to think I'd become. The first folder contained incorporation papers from 1978, when I'd founded Patterson Transportation with a single-used bus and a business loan that had taken me 3 years to pay off. Back then, I'd been Eleanor Chen, a recent widow with 3 small children and no safety net except my own determination to build something that would provide for my family's future. The second folder held contracts and expansion documents from the 1980s, when Patterson Transportation had grown from a single bus to a fleet of 12, serving 3 counties with regular routes and charter services. I remembered those years vividly, the 18-hour days, the constant stress of managing drivers and maintenance and customer complaints, while simultaneously trying to be present for my children's school events and bedtime stories. The third folder was thicker, filled with acquisition papers and merger documents from the 1990s, when Patterson Transportation had become Patterson Transit Systems, incorporating not just buses, but the entire public transportation infrastructure for the greater Pittsburgh area. By then, I'd been employing over 400 people, and my annual revenue had reached numbers that would have shocked anyone who saw me as just another suburban mother carpooling kids to soccer practice. But the fourth folder was the one that would surprise my family the most. It contained the papers for the sale of Patterson Transit Systems to Metro Regional Transportation in 2005, a transaction that had made me one of the wealthiest women in Pennsylvania while simultaneously allowing me to step back from the daily operations of running a transportation empire. I hadn't sold the company because I needed the money or because I was tired of working. I'd sold it because my children were grown and starting families of their own, and I'd wanted to be present for my grandchildren in a way that running a major corporation wouldn't allow. I'd thought I was making a sacrifice for the good of my family, choosing relationship over recognition. The irony was that Metro Regional had kept me on as a silent partner and consultant, honoring my request to remain out of the public eye while still giving me significant input on major decisions. For the past 18 years, I'd been collecting dividends and participating in board meetings via phone, watching my original company grow into the transportation network that now served most of western Pennsylvania, including the bus route I'd taken to my doctor's appointment yesterday. I pulled out my laptop, a concession to modern technology that had taken me months to master, and logged into the secure portal that Metro Regional used for board communications. There were 17 new messages waiting for me, including a quarterly report that showed the company's continued growth and a proposal for expanding service to the eastern suburbs. One message caught my attention immediately. It was from James Morrison, the current CEO, regarding a complaint that had been filed about service during yesterday's blizzard. Apparently, several routes had been suspended due to dangerous road conditions, leaving passengers stranded at bus stops throughout the city. I read the report carefully, noting that Route 47, the line that served my neighborhood, had been one of the few that had continued operating despite the storm. The drivers on that route had been commended for their dedication to passenger safety and their willingness to go above and beyond normal service requirements. My driver from yesterday, the young man who'd been so concerned about my welfare and had made a special stop at my corner, was specifically mentioned in the report. His name was David Chen, and according to his supervisor, he'd received multiple compliments from passengers about his kindness and professionalism during the storm. Chen, the same surname I'd carried before my marriage to Robert Patterson all those years ago. I wondered if David was related to me somehow, a distant cousin perhaps, or if it was simply a coincidence. The Chinese community in Pittsburgh wasn't enormous, and many families had connections that went back generations. I made a note to ask Carmen to look into David Chen's employment record when I met with her on Thursday, not because I wanted to show favoritism, but because I was curious about the young man who'd shown more concern for my well-being than my own family had. The sound of my doorbell interrupted my research. Through the peephole, I could see Rebecca, standing on my front porch, her arms full of grocery bags and her expression set in the determined lines I recognized from her childhood when she'd decided to tackle a project whether anyone wanted her help or not. "Mom, I brought you some supplies," she announced as I opened the door. "I figured after yesterday's adventure, you might be running low on essentials." She bustled past me into the kitchen, unpacking items with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly planned this expedition carefully. Bread, milk, eggs, canned soup, frozen dinners. The kind of food she apparently thought elderly people should eat. Bland and simple and requiring minimal preparation. "That's very thoughtful, dear," I said, though I was perfectly capable of doing my own grocery shopping and had been planning to go to the market that afternoon. "I also picked up some pamphlets," Rebecca continued, pulling a stack of glossy brochures from her purse, "about different senior living communities in the area. I thought we could look through them together, maybe visit a few places this weekend." She spread the pamphlets across my kitchen table like a real estate agent showing properties to potential buyers. Sunset Manor, Golden Years Village, Peaceful Meadows, Assisted Living. Each one featured photographs of smiling elderly people playing cards or tending gardens or participating in what the marketing copy described as enriching activities designed to promote wellness and social engagement. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "I've already told you I'm not interested in moving to an assisted living facility. Mom, I know you think you're fine on your own, but yesterday proved that's not necessarily true. What if something had happened to you on that bus? What if you'd fallen on the ice trying to get home? Who would have known? Who would have helped you?" The questions hung in the air between us, and I realized that Rebecca genuinely believed she was acting out of love and concern. In her mind, I was a fragile old woman who needed protection from my own independence. She couldn't see that her efforts to keep me safe were actually attempts to control my choices and limit my autonomy. "Rebecca, sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me at the kitchen table. "There are some things about my life that I think you should know." She sat reluctantly, her attention still partially focused on the assisted living brochures. "Mom, if this is about Dad again, about how you managed after he died, I know you were amazing. You raised 3 kids on your own and kept us all fed and clothed and educated. Nobody's questioning what you accomplished as a mother. This isn't about your father," I said. "This is about what I accomplished as a person." Something in my tone must have caught her attention because she finally looked up from the pamphlets and focused on my face. "What do you mean?" I walked over to my filing cabinet and pulled out one of the folders, the one containing the original incorporation. "Papers for Patterson Transportation." I placed it on the table in front of her and waited while she opened it and began to read. "I don't understand," she said after a few moments. "What is this?" "Those are the papers for the company I founded in 1978, 3 years after your father died. Patterson Transportation." Rebecca's brow furrowed as she continued reading. Mom, this doesn't make sense. You never worked for a transportation company. You were always home with us. I was home with you when you needed me, I corrected. But during the days while you were at school, I was building a business. I started with one bus and a route that served the downtown area during morning and evening commutes. Within 5 years, I had a fleet of 12 buses and contracts with the county. I could see the confusion in Rebecca's eyes as she tried to reconcile this information with her memories of her childhood. But Mom, I never saw any of this. You never talked about work, never brought business home. Because I made a choice to keep my professional life separate from my family life. When I was with you children, I was completely present. When I was working, I focused entirely on building something that would secure your futures. Rebecca turned the pages of the folder, her expression growing more bewildered with each document she examined. These papers have your maiden name on them, Eleanor Chen. Yes. I kept my maiden name for business purposes. It was easier that way, especially in those early years when being a woman in the transportation industry meant fighting for every contract and every ounce of respect. I pulled out another folder, this one containing the expansion documents from the 1980s. By the time you graduated from high school, Patterson Transportation was the largest privately owned transit company in Western Pennsylvania. We were employing over 300 people and serving 6 counties. 300 people? Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. 347, to be exact. Drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, administrative staff. People with families and mortgages and children of their own who depended on the company I'd built for their livelihoods. I opened a third folder, watching as Rebecca's eyes widened at the sight of the acquisition and merger documents. In the 1990s, when you were in college, Patterson Transportation became Patterson Transit Systems. We acquired 2 smaller companies and expanded our services to include not just buses, but the entire public transportation infrastructure for the greater Pittsburgh area. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, turning pages and studying documents with the kind of attention she usually reserved for important client files at her own job. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us any of this? Because you never asked, I said simply. You saw what you expected to see. A mother, a grandmother, someone whose primary identity was defined by her relationship to her family. It never occurred to any of you that I might have had a life and career that existed independently of being your parent. But this is incredible. You built all of this while raising 3 children by yourself? How did you manage it? The same way any working parent manages it. Very carefully, with a lot of planning and a lot of help from people who believed in what I was trying to accomplish. I hired good people and trusted them to do their jobs. I worked early in the morning and late at night after you children were asleep. I scheduled my meetings around your school events and your soccer games and your piano recitals. Rebecca was staring at me as if she'd never seen me before. What happened to the company? Do you still own it? I pulled out the final folder, the one containing the sale documents from 2005. I sold Patterson Transit Systems to Metro Regional Transportation when you started having children. I wanted to be present for my grandchildren in a way that running a major corporation wouldn't allow. You sold it? For how much? The number on the sale documents was significant enough to make Rebecca's jaw drop. She stared at the figure for several long moments before looking up at me with an expression of complete disbelief. Mom, this means you're financially comfortable, yes? It means I don't need anyone to take care of me or make decisions about my living situation. It means I have resources and options that you've never bothered to consider. Rebecca was quiet again, processing this information and what it meant for the assumptions she'd made about my life and my needs. Finally, she asked, if you sold the company in 2005, why were you taking the bus yesterday? Why don't you have a car? I smiled at the question because it got to the heart of what she still didn't understand. Rebecca, Just because I can afford something doesn't mean I need it. I chose to take the bus yesterday because it's a perfectly reasonable form of transportation, and because I wanted to experience the service that my former company provides to the community. Your former company? Metro Regional Transportation. Bought Patterson Transit Systems, but they kept me on as a silent partner and consultant. For the past 18 years, I've been collecting dividends and participating in major decisions while staying out of the public eye. The bus system you think is beneath me? I helped design it. The routes, the schedules, the safety protocols, I've had input on all of it. The weight of this revelation settled over Rebecca like a heavy blanket. She sat back in her chair, the assisted living brochures forgotten, and stared at me with a mixture of awe and confusion and something that might have been embarrassment. Mom, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. I know you didn't, and that's partly my fault for keeping it private for so long, but it's also your fault for never being curious enough to ask about my life before you were born, or my interests beyond being your mother. Rebecca picked up one of the assisted living brochures and looked at it with what appeared to be new eyes. God, I feel like such an idiot. Here I was, trying to convince you to move to some facility where they organize craft activities and bingo games, when you've been running board meetings and making corporate decisions this whole time. Not running them, I corrected. Participating in them. There's a difference. I stepped back from active management when I sold the company because I wanted to focus on family. But that doesn't mean I stopped being a businesswoman. It just means I became a businesswoman who also had time to babysit her grandchildren and attend their school plays. Why didn't you tell us? We could have been proud of you. We could have celebrated what you accomplished. You could have. I agreed. But you never asked. In all the years since your father died, in all the conversations we've had about my life and my future, not one of you has ever inquired about what I did to support our family, or how I managed to put 3 children through college without any assistance from anyone. The truth of that statement hung between us, uncomfortable but undeniable. Rebecca had grown up in a house that was always financially stable, had gone to college without worrying about student loans, had started her adult life with advantages that many of her peers didn't have. But she'd never questioned where those advantages came from or what her mother had sacrificed to provide them. I want to know, Rebecca said finally. I want to know everything. How you started the company, how you grew it, what it was like being a woman in business in the 1970s and 80s. I want to understand what you built and why you chose to step away from it. It's a long story, I warned her. I have time. And Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for treating you like you were helpless yesterday. I'm sorry for assuming you needed me to make decisions about your life. And I'm really sorry for not knowing who you really are. Her apology was sincere, and it touched something deep in my chest that had been aching for years without my fully realizing it. The pain of being invisible to the people you love most, of having your identity reduced to your relationship to them, rather than recognized for who you are as an individual. Thank you, I said. That means more to me than you know. We spent the next 3 hours at my kitchen table, with me telling Rebecca the story of how Patterson Transportation had come to be, and she listening with the kind of attention I hadn't seen from her since she was a child, asking for bedtime stories. I told her about the early days, when I'd had to prove myself to every potential client and every bank loan officer. I told her about the challenges of managing a workforce while simultaneously managing a household. I told her about the satisfaction of building something from nothing and the difficult decision to sell when success had given me choices I'd never expected to have. By the time I finished, the sun was setting and the assisted living brochures had been relegated to the recycling bin where they belonged. Mom, Rebecca said as she prepared to leave, I have one more question. What's that? The bus driver yesterday, the one who was kind to you during the storm, do you know his name? David Chen. Why? Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. Because if he works for Metro Regional Transportation, that means he technically works for you. And I think tomorrow you should call the company and make sure he gets the recognition he deserves for taking such good care of one of their most important stakeholders. For the first time in years, I felt like my daughter was beginning to see me as a person rather than just her mother. It was a start. The following morning brought unexpected visitors. I was in my study, reviewing financial reports from Metro Regional Transportation, when the doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock. Through the window, I could see a black sedan parked in my driveway, the kind of car that suggested official business rather than a social call. At the door stood a man in his 50s wearing a navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His hair was graying at the temples, and his posture conveyed the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. Mrs. Patterson? I'm James Morrison, CEO of Metro Regional Transportation. I was wondering if I might have a few minutes of your time. James Morrison. I'd been corresponding with this man for years through emails and conference calls, but we'd never met in person. He was younger than I'd imagined, with intelligent eyes and a firm handshake that suggested he understood the importance of first impressions. Of course, Mr. Morrison. Please, come in. I led him to my living room, noting how his eyes swept over the space with the practiced assessment of someone who read environments for clues about the people who inhabited them. What he saw was tasteful but modest furniture, family photographs on the mantelpiece, and bookshelves lined with everything from classic literature to contemporary business journals. Nothing that screamed wealth or power, but plenty that suggested intelligence and refinement. I apologize for dropping by unannounced, he said, as we settled into chairs across from each other. But something came to my attention yesterday that I felt required a personal conversation. Oh? What might that be? James opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder that I recognized immediately. It contained incident reports from the blizzard, including detailed accounts of passenger experiences throughout the system. One of our drivers filed a report about an elderly passenger who rode his route during the storm. According to David Chen, this passenger was forced to take public transportation to a medical appointment because her family couldn't provide a ride. He was concerned about her safety and went out of his way to ensure she reached her destination without incident. I maintained a neutral expression, curious to see where this conversation was heading. The passenger's name was Eleanor Patterson, James continued, watching my face carefully. When I saw that name in the report, I realized we needed to have a conversation that was long overdue. What kind of conversation? The kind where I acknowledged that one of the most influential figures in the history of Pittsburgh's public transportation system was treated yesterday like just another elderly passenger who couldn't afford better options. James leaned forward, his expression serious. Mrs. Patterson, in 18 years of working for Metro Regional Transportation, I've never met you in person. I've participated in conference calls where your voice carried more weight than any other board members. I've implemented strategies you've suggested that have saved the company millions of dollars and improved service for hundreds of thousands of passengers. But yesterday, you rode one of our buses in a blizzard because your family assumed you had no other choice. The weight of his words settled between us. Here was a man who understood exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished, expressing genuine concern about how I'd been treated by the very system I'd helped create. Mr. Morrison, I said carefully, may I ask how you found my address? It's listed in our emergency contact files for all board members. But, Mrs. Patterson, the fact that I had to look it up in emergency files rather than having it memorized tells you something about how we've failed you as an organization. How have you failed me? By allowing you to remain invisible for so long that even your own family doesn't understand your significance. By respecting your wishes for privacy to the point where we've made you anonymous even to yourself. James pulled another document from his folder. This is a proposal I've been working on for the past 6 months. With your permission, I'd like to share it with you." I nodded, intrigued by the direction this conversation was taking. Metro Regional Transportation is planning a major expansion over the next 5 years. New routes, upgraded vehicles, improved technology, enhanced accessibility, features. It's the kind of project that will define public transportation in Western Pennsylvania for the next generation. He handed me the proposal, a thick document bound in blue covers with official logos and charts that projected ridership growth and revenue increases. The board has approved the general concept, but we need someone to oversee the implementation. Someone with the experience and institutional knowledge to ensure the expansion serves the community rather than just increasing profits. Someone who understands both the business side and the human side of public transportation. "That sounds like a significant undertaking," I said, flipping through the pages of detailed plans and timelines. "It is. And Mrs. Patterson, there's no one more qualified to lead this project than you." The offer hung in the air between us, unexpected and intriguing. For years, I'd been content to participate in board meetings from a distance, offering advice and insight while leaving the day-to-day operations to others. But this was different. This was an invitation to step back into active leadership, to shape the future of the system I'd originally built. "Mr. Morrison, I'm 72 years old. Most people my age are considering retirement, not taking on major infrastructure projects. Most people your age haven't built what you've built. And frankly, most people half your age don't have the vision or experience necessary for a project of this scope." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Patterson, yesterday you experienced our service as a regular passenger. You saw firsthand how the system works for the people who depend on it most. That perspective, combined with your business acumen and your understanding of the community's needs, makes you uniquely qualified to lead this expansion." What would this position entail? You'd be the Director of Strategic Development, reporting directly to me but with significant autonomy to make decisions about routes, service levels, and customer experience initiatives. You'd have a budget of $50 million and a team of engineers, planners, and operations specialists. Most importantly, you'd have the authority to ensure that growth serves passengers rather than just shareholders. The magnitude of what he was proposing was both exciting and daunting. It would mean returning to the public eye, acknowledging my role in the transportation industry, and taking on responsibilities that would require significant time and energy. "I'd need to think about this," I said. "Of course. But Mrs. Patterson, I hope you'll consider not just what this opportunity could mean for Metro Regional Transportation, but what it could mean for your own legacy. Your fingerprints are already all over this system. This would be a chance to ensure they remain there for the next generation." After James left, I sat in my living room holding the proposal and thinking about roads not taken and choices that had defined my life. For 18 years, I'd been content to work behind the scenes, to influence without being seen, to contribute without claiming credit. But yesterday's experience had reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. Sometimes visibility mattered. Sometimes stepping into the light was necessary not just for your own sake, but for the sake of everyone who needed to understand that power and authority could look different than they expected. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered with some curiosity about what had prompted my youngest daughter to call during what should have been her busiest workday. "Mom, I just got off the phone with Rebecca." Sarah's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was trying to process information that didn't fit her existing understanding of the world. As a corporate attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions, she was accustomed to dealing with complex business structures and unexpected revelations. But apparently, learning that her mother had built and sold a major transportation company had caught her off guard. "She told me about your conversation yesterday. about Patterson Transportation and everything you accomplished while we were growing up. I imagine that was quite a surprise. Mom, it was more than a surprise. It was a complete revelation. I've spent my entire career working with business owners and entrepreneurs, and I never realized I was raised by one. Sarah paused, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background, as if she were reviewing documents while talking. I have so many questions, but the first one is, why didn't you ever tell us? We could have learned from your experience. We could have understood what it takes to build something from nothing. You did learn from my experience, I said gently. You learned work ethic and determination and the importance of education. You learned that obstacles are temporary and that persistence matters more than luck. You just didn't realize where those lessons were coming from. But Mom, knowing the source would have made the lessons more powerful. Understanding that you built a multi-million-dollar company while raising 3 children single-handedly would have given us a different perspective on what's possible. She was right, of course. My decision to keep my professional life private had been motivated by a desire to protect my children from the pressures and complexities of my business world. But it had also deprived them of role models and inspiration. That might have shaped their own ambitions differently. Sarah, there's something else you should know. I've been offered a position with Metro Regional Transportation, a chance to lead a major expansion project that would significantly increase public transportation options throughout the region. That's incredible. Are you going to take it? I'm considering it. But it would mean stepping back into a very public role, becoming visible in ways I've avoided for years. Mom, you should absolutely take it. Not just because you're qualified, which you obviously are, but because people need to see that leadership doesn't have an expiration date. That experience and wisdom matter more than age. Coming from Sarah, who had built her own successful career in a male-dominated profession, this encouragement carried particular weight. She understood the challenges of being underestimated and the importance of claiming your space in professional environments. There's another consideration, I said. Taking this position would mean acknowledging publicly that I've been involved with the transportation company all along. It would raise questions about why I've been so private about my role. So, let them ask questions. Let them wonder how they missed the fact that one of the most successful business owners in Pittsburgh has been hiding in plain sight for decades. After Sarah and I finished talking, I found myself thinking about visibility and legacy in ways I hadn't for years. The proposal from James Morrison wasn't just about taking on a new professional challenge. It was about deciding whether I was ready to step out of the shadows I'd carefully cultivated and reclaim my place as Eleanor Chen Patterson, businesswoman and community leader. That afternoon, I called Carmen Martinez and asked if she could move up our Thursday appointment. Of course, Eleanor. Is everything all right? Everything's fine. But I've been offered an opportunity that might require some adjustments to our existing arrangements. What kind of opportunity? The kind that would make me a public figure again. Carmen was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I'd said. Eleanor, are you sure you want to do this? We've worked very hard to maintain your privacy and protect your assets from public scrutiny. I'm sure. It's time. We scheduled a meeting for the following morning, and I spent the evening reading through the Metro Regional Transportation proposal in detail. The scope of the expansion was impressive. 17 new routes, including service to underserved communities that had been fighting for better transportation options for years, updated vehicles with improved accessibility features, technology, upgrades that would make the system more efficient and user-friendly, environmental initiatives that would reduce emissions while increasing service quality. It was exactly the kind of project I would have pursued when I was building Patterson Transportation, an opportunity to improve people's lives while building a sustainable business model, a chance to prove that public transportation could be both profitable and socially responsible. As I read, I found myself making notes in the margins, suggesting modifications and improvements based on my years of experience in the industry. route adjustments that would better serve elderly passengers, schedule changes that would accommodate shift workers, safety protocols that would address concerns I'd heard from drivers over the years. By the time I finished reviewing the proposal, I knew I was going to accept the position. Not because I needed the work or the income, but because this was an opportunity to use everything I'd learned over 5 decades in business to create something that would benefit the community long after I was gone. The next morning, Carmen arrived at my house carrying a briefcase that looked even more substantial than usual. She'd clearly been working late the previous evening, preparing for whatever adjustments I might want to make to my legal and financial arrangements. "Before we discuss your new opportunity," she said, settling into my living room with her papers spread across the coffee table, "I want to make sure you understand the implications of becoming a public figure again." "What kind of implications?" "Financial scrutiny, for one thing. If you take a visible position with Metro Regional Transportation, people will start asking questions about your background and your qualifications. Eventually, someone will discover your connection to Patterson Transportation and the sale to Metro Regional. Your financial situation will become a matter of public interest." I nodded, having anticipated this concern. "I'm prepared for that. There's also the question of your family. Once this information becomes public, your children will have to deal with questions about why they never mentioned their mother's business success. It could be uncomfortable for them professionally and personally. They'll manage, and honestly, it might be good for them to have to answer those questions. It might make them think more carefully about the assumptions they make about other people." Carmen pulled out a thick folder labeled with my name. "If you're determined to move forward, we'll need to update several documents. Your estate planning, your corporate holdings, your insurance policies. Everything will need to reflect your new public status." "What needs to change?" "For starters, we'll need to establish clearer boundaries between your personal assets and your professional responsibilities. Right now, your wealth is largely invisible because it's held in trusts and private investments. If you're going to be in the public eye, we need to ensure that your personal finances are protected from any potential liability related to your corporate activities." Carmen opened another folder, this one containing documents I hadn't seen in years. "We'll also need to address the question of your ownership stake in Metro Regional Transportation. As a silent partner, your dividends and consulting fees have been handled through private agreements. If you become an active employee, those arrangements will need to be restructured. How significant is my ownership stake? Based on the original sale agreement and the performance clauses we negotiated, you currently own approximately 15% of Metro Regional Transportation. At current valuation, that represents an asset worth roughly $42 million. The number hung in the air between us, substantial and slightly surreal. I'd known that my partnership agreement included performance bonuses and equity increases, but I hadn't been tracking the exact value of my holdings. Hearing it stated so directly was a reminder of just how successful the company I'd built had become under Metro Regional's management. "Carmen, what would happen if I accepted this director position and then decided to exercise my rights as a major shareholder?" "You mean if you wanted to take a more active role in corporate governance?" "I mean if I wanted to ensure that the expansion project serves the community rather than just increasing profits for investors." Carmen smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for this conversation. "Eleanor, as a 15% shareholder and a board member, you already have significant influence over corporate decisions. As the Director of Strategic Development, you'd have operational authority over the expansion project. Combined, those 2 roles would give you more power over the future of public transportation in this region than anyone else, including James Morrison." The implications of what she was saying were both exciting and sobering. I wouldn't just be accepting a job. I'd be positioning myself to shape transportation policy for hundreds of thousands of people while simultaneously protecting the investment I'd made decades earlier when I'd sold my company. "There's one more thing," Carmen said, pulling out A final document. I took the liberty of researching David Chen, the bus driver who helped you during the storm. What did you find? He's been with Metro Regional for 6 years. Excellent performance reviews, multiple commendations from passengers, no disciplinary actions. But Eleanor, there's something else. David Chen is the grandson of Henry Chen, who worked as a mechanic for Patterson Transportation in the 1980s. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. Henry Chen had been one of my most reliable employees, a man who'd understood buses and their maintenance needs better than anyone I'd ever worked with. He'd been instrumental in developing the preventive maintenance protocols that had kept Patterson Transportation's vehicles running safely and efficiently for years. Henry's grandson, I murmured. That explains the surname coincidence. It also explains why David was so attentive to your needs during the storm. The Chen family has always understood the importance of treating passengers with respect and dignity. It's a tradition that apparently passes from generation to generation. Carmen, I want you to research David's career path within Metro Regional. I want to understand what opportunities are available for drivers who show leadership potential. Are you thinking of offering him a promotion? I'm thinking of making sure that good people are recognized and rewarded appropriately. If I'm going to be involved in this expansion project, I want to ensure that the human resources side receives as much attention as the infrastructure side. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing and updating documents, establishing the legal framework that would allow me to step back into public life while protecting the interests I'd built over decades of careful planning. By the time Carmen left, I had a clear understanding of both the opportunities and the responsibilities that came with accepting James Morrison's offer. That evening, I called James and scheduled a meeting for the following day. I assume you've had time to review the proposal, he said when I reached him at his office. I have. And I have some questions and suggestions that I'd like to discuss in person. Excellent. Does that mean you're interested in the position? It means I'm ready to negotiate the terms under which I might accept it. James laughed, the sound of someone who appreciated direct communication. Mrs. Patterson, I have a feeling this is going to be a very interesting conversation. The next morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with James Morrison. Not in the conservative, understated clothing I usually wore, but in the navy blue suit I'd purchased years earlier for board meetings and corporate events. The suit still fit perfectly, and wearing it reminded me of the confidence I'd felt when I'd been actively building my business empire. I arrived at the Metro Regional Transportation headquarters 15 minutes early, giving myself time to walk through the building and observe the operations from a different perspective. The lobby was bustling with activity, employees moving purposefully between meetings, visitors checking in for appointments, delivery personnel bringing packages and documents. What struck me most was the diversity of the workforce. Men and women of different ages and ethnicities, people who represented the community the transportation system served. It was exactly what I'd hoped to achieve when I'd built Patterson Transportation, and it was gratifying to see that Metro Regional had maintained and expanded that commitment to inclusive hiring. James met me in the lobby personally, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. He escorted me to a conference room on the top floor, one with windows that offered a panoramic view of the city and the bus routes that crisscrossed the urban landscape like arteries carrying the lifeblood of the community. Mrs. Patterson, thank you for coming in. I hope you've had time to consider our proposal thoroughly. I have, and I'm prepared to accept the position, subject to certain conditions. James leaned forward, his expression attentive. What kind of conditions? First, I want operational autonomy over the expansion project. I'll report to you on major milestones and budget issues, but day-to-day decisions about routes, schedules, and service quality will be mine to make. Agreed. Second, I want the authority to implement employee development programs that ensure drivers and support staff have opportunities for advancement within the organization. Also agreed. Third, I want a commitment that the expansion will prioritize service to underserved communities, even if those routes are initially less profitable than others. Mrs. Patterson, those priorities align perfectly with our corporate mission. I can't imagine why you'd think I'd object to them. I smiled, appreciating his directness. Because in my experience, corporate missions and operational realities don't always align. I wanted in writing that community service takes precedence over short-term profit maximization. You'll have it. Finally, I want my role as a major shareholder to be disclosed publicly when we announce my appointment. No more silent partnerships. No more anonymous influence. If I'm going to lead this project, I want the community to understand that I have a personal as well as professional investment in its success. James was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I'd requested. Mrs. Patterson, are you sure about that? Once your ownership stake becomes public knowledge, you'll face scrutiny about everything from your business practices to your personal finances. I'm sure. It's time for me to stop hiding behind privacy and start using my visibility to advocate for the things I believe in. We spent the next hour working through the details of my appointment, including my salary, which I negotiated to be donated directly to a scholarship fund for transportation industry employees pursuing continuing education. If I was going to be a public figure again, I wanted my compensation to reflect my commitment to the community rather than my personal financial needs. As we concluded our meeting, James asked one final question. Mrs. Patterson, what made you decide to step back into the spotlight after so many years of preferring anonymity? I thought about the blizzard, about standing at that bus stop while my own daughter dismissed my needs as inconvenient. I thought about David Chen's kindness and Carmen's research revealing the connections between past and present that I'd been ignoring. I thought about Rebecca's shock at discovering who I really was, and Sarah's encouragement to claim my place in the world. Mr. Morrison, I realize that privacy is a luxury I can no longer afford. There are too many people who need to understand that leadership, competence, and vision don't have expiration dates. If my visibility helps even one person reconsider their assumptions about what elderly women are capable of, then it's worth whatever scrutiny comes with it. James smiled and extended his hand. Mrs. Patterson, welcome back to Metro Regional Transportation. I think this is going to be the beginning of something remarkable. As I shook his hand, I felt a familiar sensation, one I hadn't experienced in years. The thrill of embarking on a new challenge, the satisfaction of using my skills and experience to make a difference, the confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of accomplishing. Tomorrow, there would be press releases and media interviews and questions from reporters who would want to understand how a 72-year-old grandmother had become one of the most powerful figures in regional transportation. My children would have to adjust to having a mother who was suddenly a public figure. My neighbors would discover that the quiet woman next door was actually a millionaire businesswoman with decades of corporate experience. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Chen Patterson, sitting in my living room and feeling more like myself than I had in years. The press conference was scheduled for Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock, giving me exactly 5 days to prepare for what would essentially be my coming out party as a public figure. James Morrison had suggested we hold it at the Metro Regional Transportation Headquarters, but I had a different idea. I want to hold it at the bus station on 5th Avenue, I told him during our planning call on Friday afternoon. The one that serves the route I took during the blizzard. Mrs. Patterson, that's a working transit facility. It might be difficult to manage the logistics of a media event in that environment. Mr. Morrison, if we're announcing an expansion of public transportation services, shouldn't we do it in a place where the public actually uses transportation? Shouldn't reporters see firsthand what we're talking about improving? There was a pause, and I could practically hear him reconsidering his assumptions about appropriate venues for corporate announcements. You make an excellent point. I'll have our facilities team coordinate with the station management. Over the weekend, I found myself fielding phone calls from my children, each of them processing the news of my impending return to public life in their own way. Michael called from Denver on Saturday morning, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment that had become familiar over the past week. "Mom, Rebecca told me about the job offer, but I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around all of this. You're really going to be running a $50 million infrastructure project?" "I'm going to be directing it, yes, with input from engineers and planners who know more about the technical aspects than I do, but with final authority over the strategic decisions." "And this is something you feel qualified to handle?" The question stung a little, though I understood it came from genuine concern rather than doubt about my abilities. Michael had spent his entire adult life knowing me as his mother and grandmother, someone whose professional expertise had never been part of our family conversations. "Michael, I built a transportation company from a single bus into a regional network that employed hundreds of people and served millions of passengers. I sold that company for enough money to secure your children's college educations and their children's after that. I've been consulting on transportation policy and strategy for nearly 2 decades. Yes, I feel qualified." "I didn't mean to question your abilities, Mom. It's just that this is all so new to me. Learning that you've been this successful businesswoman all along, and now finding out you're taking on this huge public role. It's a lot to process." "I understand that. But Michael, this is who I've always been. The only thing that's changing is that I'm no longer keeping it private," Sarah called on Sunday evening, her tone more enthusiastic than her siblings had been. As someone who worked in corporate law, she understood the significance of what I was undertaking in ways that Rebecca and Michael were still struggling to grasp. "Mom, I've been doing some research on metro regional transportation, and this expansion project is going to be huge. I mean, front page business section, state-level political implications huge. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" "I'm prepared for whatever comes with doing the job well. The scrutiny is secondary." "Have you thought about hiring a public relations firm? Someone who can help you manage the media attention and protect your privacy where you want to maintain it?" It was a practical suggestion, the kind of forward-thinking advice I would have expected from my lawyer daughter. But it also revealed something about how Sarah was conceptualizing my new role. She was thinking about damage control and image management, approaching my return to public life as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity to be embraced. "Sarah, I appreciate the suggestion, but I think I can handle my own public relations. I've been managing corporate communications longer than most PR firms have been in business." "Of course you can. I just want to make sure you have all the support you need." What none of my children seemed to understand yet was that I didn't need their protection or guidance as I stepped back into the business world. What I needed was their recognition that this transition represented a return to my authentic self rather than a departure from who I'd always been. Monday morning brought a call from David Chen, the bus driver whose kindness during the blizzard had inadvertently set this entire sequence of events in motion. His voice was respectful but curious as he introduced himself and explained why he was calling. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind me contacting you directly. Mr. Morrison gave me your number and said you'd asked about my employment record." "I don't mind at all, David. I wanted to thank you personally for your consideration during that storm last week. Your professionalism and compassion made a difficult situation much more bearable." "Thank you, ma'am, but I have to admit, I'm confused about something. Mr. Morrison seemed to think you were someone important, someone whose opinion about my performance would carry special weight. He mentioned you were going to be taking a leadership role with the company." I could hear the genuine puzzlement in his voice, and I realized that David was experiencing the same cognitive dissonance my children had faced. He'd seen me as a vulnerable elderly passenger in need of assistance, and now he was being told I was actually a corporate executive with significant authority over his workplace. "David, what do you know about the history of metro regional transportation?" "Not much beyond what we covered in orientation. I know the company was formed through a merger with a smaller local firm back in the early 2000s. That smaller local firm was Patterson Transportation. I founded Patterson Transportation in 1978 and built it into the largest private transit company in western Pennsylvania before selling it to Metro Regional in 2005. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a note of awe. "Ma'am, are you telling me that the lady I helped onto the bus during the blizzard was the person who originally created the bus system I work for?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And David, I also want you to know that your grandfather Henry worked for Patterson Transportation in the 1980s. He was one of our best mechanics, and his commitment to safety and service excellence apparently runs in the family." Another pause, longer this time. My grandfather used to tell stories about working for a woman who owned a bus company. He said she was tough but fair, and that she cared more about doing the job right than about making quick profits. I never knew her name, but he always spoke about her with enormous respect. Your grandfather was a good man and an excellent employee. I was sorry to lose him when he retired. Mrs. Patterson, I don't know what to say. Learning that you're that woman, and that you saw how I treated you during the storm, it's overwhelming. David, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. In your 6 years with Metro Regional, have you ever considered pursuing opportunities beyond driving? What do you mean? I mean management positions, training roles, leadership opportunities within the organization. Have you thought about advancing your career beyond the driver's seat? Sometimes, yes. But those kinds of opportunities don't come up very often for people like me. People like you meaning what, exactly? Drivers who don't have college degrees or business backgrounds. The management positions usually go to people who come from outside the company, people with MBAs or transportation planning degrees. It was exactly the kind of institutional barrier I'd fought against when I was building Patterson Transportation. The assumption that operational experience was less valuable than academic credentials, that the people who actually did the work of moving passengers safely and efficiently somehow lacked the qualifications to lead those efforts. David, would you be interested in participating in a professional development program that could prepare you for supervisory and management roles within the company? Are you offering me something like that? I'm exploring the possibility of creating something like that. For drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, and other frontline employees who've demonstrated excellence in their current roles and have the potential to take on additional responsibilities. Mrs. Patterson, that would be incredible, not just for me, but for a lot of people who work in operations. We see things from the ground level that management sometimes misses. That's exactly why I think it's important to create pathways for operational staff to move into leadership positions. David, I'd like you to think about whether you'd be interested in being part of a pilot program for this kind of professional development. It would involve additional training and responsibilities, but it could also lead to advancement opportunities that don't currently exist. I'd definitely be interested. And Mrs. Patterson, thank you for seeing potential in people like me. After I hung up, I spent some time thinking about the conversation and what it revealed about the current state of Metro Regional Transportation. Despite the company's apparent success and growth, there were still opportunities to improve how it developed and promoted talent from within the organization. It was exactly the kind of systemic issue I could address in my new role as Director of Strategic Development. Tuesday brought a rehearsal for the press conference, held in a conference room at Metro Regional Headquarters with James Morrison and his communications team. The questions they'd prepared were straightforward and professional, covering my background, my qualifications for the position, and my vision for the expansion project. Mrs. Patterson, said Jennifer Walsh, the company's communications director, the reporters will probably want to know why you've been so private about your business background for so many years. How do you want to handle questions about your anonymity? Honestly and directly. I'll explain that I chose to step back from public visibility when I sold the company because I wanted to focus on family and because I believed the new leadership deserved the opportunity to put their own stamp on the organization. And what about questions regarding your current ownership stake in the company? That information will become public when we file the required disclosure documents. I'll acknowledge my shareholder status and explain that it gives me both a financial and personal investment in the success of the expansion project. James looked up from his notes. Mrs. Patterson, are you prepared for questions about your age? Some reporters might suggest that 72 is too old for this kind of demanding leadership role. I smiled at the question, having anticipated it from the moment I'd decided to accept the position. Mr. Morrison, I'll simply point out that wisdom and experience don't expire on someone's 72nd birthday. I'll note that mandatory retirement ages are illegal in most industries, precisely because competence isn't determined by chronological age. And if anyone wants to question my capabilities, I'll invite them to review my track record over the past 5 decades in business. The rehearsal went smoothly, and by the end of the session, I felt confident about my ability to handle whatever questions the actual press conference might bring. The communications team seemed impressed by my preparedness and my willingness to address potentially challenging topics directly rather than deflecting or evading. Wednesday morning arrived clear and cold, with the kind of crisp air that made everything feel sharp and focused. I dressed in the same navy suit I'd worn to my meeting with James, paired with a silk scarf that had been a gift from Rebecca years earlier. I wanted to look professional and authoritative, but also approachable and authentic. The bus station on Fifth Avenue had been transformed for the occasion. A small stage had been erected near the main boarding area, with microphones and cameras, positioned to capture both the speakers and the backdrop of buses and passengers going about their daily routines. It was exactly the setting I'd envisioned, one that would remind everyone watching that public transportation was about real people and real communities, not just budgets and bureaucracy. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled start time, giving myself an opportunity to observe the setup and chat with some of the early arriving reporters. Several of them recognized me from the promotional materials that had been distributed, but their questions were limited to basic logistics about the event, rather than substantive inquiries about my background or qualifications. At exactly 10 o'clock, James Morrison stepped to the podium and began the presentation with an overview of Metro Regional Transportation's growth and success over the past 18 years. He spoke about the company's commitment to serving the community and its plans for expanding service to meet the region's evolving transportation needs. Today, I'm pleased to announce that Metro Regional Transportation has appointed Eleanor Chen Patterson as Director of Strategic Development, with responsibility for overseeing our $50 million expansion initiative. James gestured toward me, and I stepped forward to the podium, feeling the weight of dozens of cameras and microphones focused on my presence. The assembled reporters looked expectant, but not particularly interested, clearly assuming this was a routine corporate appointment, rather than anything newsworthy. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'm honored to accept this position and excited about the opportunity to help shape the future of public transportation in Western Pennsylvania. I paused, looking out over the crowd of journalists and noting their expressions, of polite attention mixed with mild impatience. They were here because their editors had assigned them to cover what seemed like a standard business announcement, not because they expected to hear anything particularly compelling. Before I discuss our expansion plans, I think it's important for you to understand my qualifications for this role and my connection to the public transportation system we're working to improve. I took a breath, knowing that the next words would fundamentally change how this press conference was perceived and covered. In 1978, I founded Patterson Transportation with a single used bus and a determination to provide reliable, affordable transit service to communities that were being underserved by existing options. Over the next 27 years, I built Patterson, transportation into the largest privately owned transit company in western Pennsylvania, employing over 400 people and serving more than 2 million passengers annually. The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. Reporters who had been checking their phones or reviewing other stories suddenly focused their full attention on the podium. Cameras that had been positioned for routine coverage adjusted to ensure they were capturing every word and expression. In 2005, I sold Patterson Transportation to Metro Regional Transportation for a price that reflected both the company's financial success and its strategic value to the region's transportation infrastructure. As part of that sale, I retained a 15% ownership stake in Metro Regional and have served as a consulting board member for the past 18 years. One reporter in the front row was frantically scribbling notes, while another had already pulled out her phone to check facts or contact her editor. The energy in the room had completely transformed from routine corporate coverage to breaking news. What this means is that the expansion project I'll be directing represents both a professional opportunity and a personal investment. As a major shareholder and the founder of the original company that became Metro Regional Transportation, I have every incentive to ensure that this expansion serves the community effectively and operates sustainably for decades to come. I paused again, allowing the information to sink in and giving the reporters time to process the implications of what they'd just learned. The expansion will include 17 new routes, with priority given to neighborhoods that currently lack adequate transportation options. We'll be upgrading our entire fleet with vehicles that meet the highest standards for accessibility, environmental efficiency, and passenger comfort. And we'll be implementing new technology that will make our system more reliable and user-friendly for riders of all ages and abilities. Hands shot up around the room as reporters prepared to ask the questions I'd been anticipating all week. I pointed to a woman from the Pittsburgh Tribune who had been covering transportation issues for years. Mrs. Patterson, can you help us understand why your business background wasn't public knowledge until today? Why have you been operating as a silent partner for so many years? When I sold Patterson Transportation, I made a conscious decision to step back from public visibility and allow the new leadership team to establish their own identity and priorities. I wanted to be available as a resource and advisor, but I didn't want my presence to overshadow their authority or create confusion about who was responsible for the company's direction. A reporter from Channel 11 raised his hand. Mrs. Patterson, what made you decide to return to a public leadership role now? 2 factors. First, the scale and importance of this expansion project requires someone with deep institutional knowledge and a long-term perspective on the region's transportation needs. Second, I've realized that privacy can sometimes become invisibility, and there are benefits to having leadership that reflects the diversity of our community, including age diversity. Another hand went up. Can you comment on reports that you were recently seen taking public transportation during the blizzard last week? Is it true that you ride the buses regularly? I smiled at the question, knowing that this was the moment where the human interest angle of the story would emerge. Yes, I do ride public transportation regularly. In fact, my experience as a passenger during that storm reinforced my commitment to ensuring that our system serves riders safely and reliably, even under challenging conditions. Were you testing the service, or was this a personal necessity? It was a personal necessity. I needed to get to a medical appointment, and public transportation was my best option that day. The experience reminded me that for many residents of this region, public transportation isn't a choice or a convenience. It's an essential service that people depend on for access to healthcare, employment, education, and community resources. I could see several reporters making notes about the human interest potential of this angle. The image of a wealthy businesswoman taking the bus out of necessity rather than choice would make for compelling coverage, especially when combined with the revelation about her ownership stake in the company. Mrs. Patterson, called out AI, reporter from the Post-Gazette. At 72, you're significantly older than most corporate executives taking on new leadership roles. Do you have any concerns about your ability to handle the demands of this position? It was the question I'd been most prepared for, and I answered it with the confidence that came from decades of proving myself in challenging professional environments. Age brings experience, perspective, and institutional memory that can't be replicated or fast-tracked. I've been involved in every aspect of public transportation operations, from driving buses to negotiating union contracts to designing route networks. I understand this industry in ways that someone half my age with twice the formal education simply cannot, regardless of their other qualifications. I looked directly at the reporter who had asked the question. More importantly, I'm not approaching this position as someone looking to build a career or establish a reputation. I'm approaching it as someone who wants to use everything I've learned over 5 decades in business to create something that will benefit this community long after I'm gone. That's a different kind of motivation, and I think it's exactly what this project needs. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from budget details to timeline projections to my plans for community engagement. With each answer, I could feel myself settling back into the rhythm of public leadership, the confidence that came from knowing my subject matter thoroughly and being able to communicate complex ideas clearly and persuasively. As the press conference concluded, several reporters approached me individually for follow-up interviews or additional quotes. Jennifer Walsh, the communications director, looked slightly stunned by the level of interest the announcement had generated. "Mrs. Patterson," she said as we prepared to leave the bus station, "I think we may have underestimated how much attention this story is going to receive." "That's probably accurate," I agreed, "but attention isn't necessarily a problem as long as it focuses on the work we're doing rather than just the novelty of who's doing it." James Morrison joined us as we walked back to the headquarters building. "Eleanor, that was masterful. You controlled that room completely, and you made the expansion project sound both ambitious and achievable." "Thank you. But James, I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Once this story starts circulating, we're going to have stakeholders, politicians, and community groups who want to weigh in on our plans. The visibility cuts both ways. Are you concerned about that?" "Not concerned, but realistic. Public scrutiny can be helpful when it keeps us accountable to our commitments, but it can also create pressure to make decisions based on politics rather than good planning. We'll need to stay focused on what serves the community best, even when that's not what generates the most positive headlines." That evening, I sat in my living room watching the news coverage of the press conference on 3 different channels. Each station had approached the story from a slightly different angle, but all of them had led with the revelation about my business background and ownership stake in Metro Regional Transportation. Channel 4 had focused on the human interest aspect, featuring footage of me at the bus station combined with interviews with passengers who expressed surprise and approval at learning that someone with significant transportation experience would be leading the expansion project. Channel 11 had taken a more business-focused approach, including financial analysis of Metro Regional's growth over the past 18 years, and speculation about how my leadership might affect the company's stock price and competitive position. The Tribune's online story had already generated dozens of comments, ranging from congratulations on my appointment to questions about why my business success hadn't been more widely known in the local community. My phone had been ringing steadily since the press conference ended, with calls from former employees, old business associates, and community leaders who wanted to congratulate me on my new role or express their support for the expansion project. I'd let most of the calls go to voicemail, planning to return them systematically over the next few days. But there was one call I answered immediately when I saw the name on the caller ID. David Chen. "Mrs. Patterson, I just saw the news coverage of your press conference. I wanted to thank you for mentioning the importance of frontline employee development. Knowing that someone in your position values the experience and perspective of drivers and mechanics, it means a lot to all of us who work in operations." "David, that wasn't just rhetoric for the media. I meant every word of it. In fact, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you next week to discuss that professional development program we talked about. I think it's time to move from concept to implementation. Really? You want to start working on that already? David, I've learned that the best time to implement good ideas is as soon as possible, before other priorities crowd them out. Are you available Monday afternoon? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. After I hung up, I realized that for the first time in years, I was looking forward to Monday morning. Not because I needed the work or the validation, but because I had the opportunity to use everything I'd learned and accomplished over 5 decades to create something meaningful for people like David Chen and his grandfather Henry, for passengers who depended on public transportation to access the opportunities and services they needed, and for a community that deserved a transportation system that reflected the best of what was possible rather than the minimum of what was acceptable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be budget meetings and engineering consultations and community forums. There would be political pressures and media scrutiny and stakeholder expectations to manage. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Chen Patterson, sitting in the living room of the house I'd bought with the profits from my first successful year in business, planning the next chapter of a career that had never really ended, only paused while I focused on being the kind of mother and grandmother my family needed. The blizzard that had forced me to take the bus seemed like a lifetime ago, even though it had been less than 2 weeks. That woman standing at the bus stop, dismissed by her daughter and invisible to her community, felt like a different person entirely. Not because I'd changed, but because I'd finally stopped hiding who I'd always been. The story broke nationally by Thursday morning. I woke to find my phone flooded with messages from reporters across the country, all wanting to know more about the 72-year-old woman who had apparently been hiding in plain sight as one of Pennsylvania's most successful entrepreneurs. The Associated Press had picked up the story, and within hours it was being covered by major networks and newspapers from coast to coast. Transportation pioneer emerges from decades of anonymity, read the headline in the Washington Post. The I.O. grandmother who built an empire. While no one was watching, proclaimed USA Today. CNN had scheduled a segment about my story for their afternoon business program, and I'd already declined interview requests from 3 different morning shows. The phone rang as I was reviewing the coverage over my morning coffee. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was immediately familiar. Eleanor, this is Margaret Blackwood from the Women's Business Leadership Council. I hope you remember me from the Transportation Symposium in 1995. I did remember Margaret, a fierce advocate for women in male-dominated industries who had built her own logistics company from the ground up. We'd served on several panels together over the years, discussing the unique challenges faced by women entrepreneurs in the transportation sector. Of course, Margaret, it's wonderful to hear from you. Eleanor, I'm calling because what you've done this week is exactly what our industry needs. You've proven that experience and competence don't diminish with age, and that women can lead major infrastructure projects just as effectively as anyone else. The Council would like to honor you at our annual conference next month. That's very generous, but I'm not sure I deserve special recognition for simply doing my job. Eleanor, you're not just doing your job. You're redefining what leadership looks like in our industry. Do you have any idea how many women have called me this week saying your story inspired them to pursue opportunities they thought were beyond their reach? I hadn't considered that aspect of the attention my announcement had generated. I'd been focused on the immediate implications for my work and my family, not thinking about how my visibility might affect other women who were facing their own challenges with age discrimination or gender bias in professional settings. Margaret, if my story helps other women advocate for themselves, then I'm honored to be part of that conversation. Excellent. I'll have my assistant send you the details about the conference. And Eleanor, welcome back to the spotlight. We've missed having you there. The next call came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Patricia Morales had been one of my first employees at Patterson Transportation, starting as a dispatcher and eventually becoming my operations manager. When I sold the company, Patricia had stayed on with Metro Regional and worked her way up to regional supervisor before retiring 5 years ago. Eleanor, I saw the news coverage and I had to call. I'm so proud of you for stepping back into leadership. The industry needs people who understand that transportation is about serving communities, not just maximizing shareholder returns. Patricia, how are you? I've often wondered what you were up to in retirement. Actually, that's part of why I'm calling. Since retiring, I've been volunteering with a nonprofit that helps low-income residents access job training and employment opportunities. One of our biggest challenges is transportation. Many of the people we serve live in neighborhoods with limited bus service, and they can't afford cars. The expansion you're planning could literally change lives. Patricia's words reminded me of why I'd gotten into the transportation business in the first place. It wasn't about building a corporate empire or accumulating wealth. It was about understanding that mobility was freedom, that access to reliable transportation could mean the difference between poverty and opportunity for thousands of families. Patricia, I'd like to invite you to serve on the Community Advisory Committee for the Expansion Project. We need voices like yours to ensure we're designing routes and schedules that actually serve the people who need them most. I would be honored. Eleanor, you don't know how encouraging it is to see someone with your values back in a position of influence. By Friday afternoon, the response to my appointment had generated enough interest that James Morrison suggested we schedule a follow-up media event to address the expanded coverage and demonstrate our commitment to community engagement. Eleanor, the mayor's office has been fielding calls all week from neighborhood groups and advocacy organizations who want to be involved in the planning process. I think we should host a public forum where residents can ask questions and share their priorities directly. That's an excellent idea. But James, I want to make sure this isn't just a public relations exercise. If we invite community input, we need to be prepared to actually incorporate their feedback into our planning. Agreed. And I think having you lead these discussions will demonstrate that we're serious about responsive leadership. People trust someone who built this system more than they trust corporate executives who parachuted in from other industries. The public forum was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the downtown library, a venue that was accessible by multiple bus routes and familiar to residents throughout the region. The response was overwhelming. More than 300 people attended, filling the main auditorium and requiring us to set up overflow seating in adjacent rooms with video monitors. I stood at the podium looking out over an audience that represented the full diversity of our community. Elderly residents who relied on public transportation for medical appointments and grocery shopping. Working parents who needed reliable service to get to jobs and daycare pickups on time. Students who depended on buses to reach schools and colleges. Disabled individuals who required accessible vehicles and properly maintained station platforms. Thank you for coming tonight, I began. Before we discuss our expansion plans, I want to hear from you about what's working well with our current system and what needs to be improved. For the next 2 hours, I listened to stories that reminded me why this work mattered. A woman who had lost 2 jobs because unreliable bus service made her chronically late. A man who spent 4 hours daily commuting to his factory job because no direct route served his neighborhood. A college student who had to choose between taking evening classes and getting home safely because service ended too early. But I also heard success stories. A grandmother who had been able to maintain her independence because of accessible bus designs. A recent immigrant who had found employment thanks to routes that connected his apartment to the industrial district where he worked. A disabled veteran who praised the professionalism and patience of drivers who helped him navigate the system. Mrs. Patterson, said a woman in her 40s who identified herself as Maria Gonzalez. My mother worked as a hotel housekeeper for 30 years. She took 3 different buses to get to work every day because we couldn't afford a car. She always said the bus drivers treated her with respect, like her work mattered. Will the new routes have the same kind of drivers? Ms. Gonzalez, the drivers who work for our system now will continue to be the backbone of our expanded service. But I also want to ensure that we're creating pathways for professional development within the organization, so that excellent drivers can advance to training and supervisory roles if they choose to. An elderly man in the back row raised his hand. Mrs. Patterson, I heard on the news that you're one of the owners of the bus company. Does that mean you're doing this to make money, or because you actually care about serving the community? It was a fair question, and I appreciated his directness. Sir, you're right that I have a financial stake in Metro Regional Transportation, but let me put that in perspective. If I cared only about maximizing profits, I would advocate for routes that serve wealthy suburbs, where ridership would be high and maintenance costs would be low. Instead, I'm prioritizing service to neighborhoods that have been underserved, even though those routes may not be immediately profitable. I paused, looking around the room at faces that reflected decades of experience with public transportation, systems that had often failed to meet their needs. My financial investment in this company is significant, but my personal investment in this community is much greater. I've lived here for 50 years. I raised my children here. This is my home, and I want to leave behind a transportation system that serves everyone who calls this place home. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, and I could see in people's faces that they understood I wasn't just offering corporate talking points. I was making a commitment that they could hold me accountable for in the months and years to come. After the forum ended, I stayed for another hour, talking individually with residents who had specific concerns or suggestions. David Chen was there, having attended on his own time to hear community feedback about the system he served daily. I watched him take notes and ask thoughtful questions, and I made a mental note to accelerate his professional development program. Mrs. Patterson, said a young woman who introduced herself as Jennifer Wu. I'm a reporter for the Asian Pacific Times. I wanted to ask you about your experience as an Asian American woman in business during the 1970s and 80s. Were there particular challenges you faced because of your ethnicity? Us? It was a question that brought back memories I hadn't revisited in years. The bank loan officers who had questioned my English skills despite my perfect grammar. The contractors who had assumed I was someone's secretary rather than the company owner. The clients who had been surprised to discover that Yi Chen was a woman, and an Asian woman at that. Ms. Wu, there were definitely challenges. Some were obvious, like people making assumptions about my capabilities based on my appearance or my name. Others were more subtle, like being excluded from informal networks where business relationships were built and deals were negotiated. How did you overcome those barriers? By being better prepared than anyone else in the room, by exceeding expectations consistently, by building relationships with people who valued competence over comfort, and by remembering that my success wasn't just about me. Every contract I won, every standard I exceeded, every barrier I broke made it a little easier for the women who came after me. Jennifer nodded, clearly understanding the broader implications of my story. Mrs. Patterson, do you think your visibility now, at this stage of your career, sends a different message than it would have 30 years ago? I think it sends a message that needed to be sent 30 years ago, but is even more important now. That leadership doesn't have an expiration date. That experience is valuable. That the people who built the systems we depend on might have insights worth listening to, regardless of their age or gender or ethnicity. The weekend brought an unexpected visitor. I was working in my garden on Saturday morning when a car pulled into my driveway. To my surprise, Rebecca emerged, followed by her husband David and their 2 children, Emma and Jake. Mom, we wanted to see how you were handling all the media attention, Rebecca said as the family approached. The kids have been asking questions about their grandmother being on television. 8-year-old Emma looked at me with wide eyes. Grandma, are you famous now? I knelt down to her level, brushing dirt from my gardening gloves. Not famous, sweetheart, just doing a job that people are interested in learning about. But you're on the news, insisted 10-year-old Jake. My friends at school saw you on TV talking about buses. That's right. I'm helping to plan new bus routes so that people can get to work and school and the doctor's office more easily. Rebecca was watching this exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her children were processing information about their grandmother that she was still struggling to understand herself. "Mom," Rebecca said as we walked toward the house, "I owe you an apology that goes deeper than what I said last week." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent years treating you like you were becoming irrelevant as you got older. Like your opinions mattered less, like your capabilities were diminishing, like your main value was as a babysitter and holiday host. I completely failed to see that you were actually more accomplished and more capable than most people half your hoter." We settled on the porch while David entertained the children in the backyard. Rebecca looked exhausted, as if the past 2 weeks had required her to fundamentally reconsider everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. "Rebecca, you weren't wrong to want to protect me or to be concerned about my well-being. Those are natural responses when you love someone. But I was wrong to assume that needing protection and being capable of leadership were mutually exclusive. I was wrong to think that getting older automatically meant getting less competent or less valuable. What changed your mind?" "Watching the news coverage this week, seeing how reporters and community leaders responded to your appointment, reading the comments from people who said your story inspired them to reconsider their own assumptions about aging and capability. I realized that my attitudes toward you weren't just wrong, they were harmful." Rebecca paused, watching her children play in the yard where she had once played as a child. "I also realized that I've been so focused on managing your life that I stopped seeing you as a person with your own goals and dreams and ambitions. When you asked for a ride to the doctor's office, I saw it as an imposition rather than an opportunity to support someone I love who was dealing with a difficult situation. The blizzard seems like a long time ago now." "It does. But Mom, I keep thinking about how different that day might have been if I had just said yes to your request. If I had driven you to your appointment and spent the time talking with you about your life and your experiences, instead of dismissing you as someone who needed to be managed rather than respected. It was the conversation we should have had years earlier, but I was grateful we were having it now." Rebecca was processing not just the revelation about my business background, but the deeper questions about how we treat elderly family members and what assumptions we make about their continued capacity for growth and contribution. "Rebecca, I want you to know that I don't regret keeping my business life private for as long as I did. It allowed me to be present for you and your siblings in ways that might not have been possible if I had been a public figure throughout your childhood. But I do regret that my privacy became invisibility, and that you grew up without understanding that it's possible to be both a devoted mother and a successful professional. I wish I had known, not because it would have changed how much I loved you, but because it would have given me a different model for what women can accomplish." That evening, after Rebecca's family had gone home, I called Michael and Sarah on a 3-way conference call to update them on the week's developments and to have the kind of conversation we should have been having for years. "I want both of you to know that the media attention has been largely positive, but it's also been intense," I told them. "You may receive calls from reporters wanting to interview you about growing up as my children. You should feel free to decline those interviews or to participate if you're comfortable doing so." "Mom," said Sarah, "I've been thinking about what this means for our family going forward. Are you planning to stay in this public role for the long term?" "I'm committed to seeing the expansion project through to completion, which will probably take 3 to 5 years. After that, I'll evaluate whether I want to continue in active leadership or return to an advisory role." Michael spoke up from Denver. "Mom, I have to ask this. Are you doing this because you missed the business world, or because you were unhappy with how we were treating you?" It was a perceptive question, and I appreciated his willingness to examine his own behavior honestly. "Both, probably. I missed the intellectual challenge and the sense of purpose that comes from working on projects that affect thousands of people's daily lives. But I also realized that I had become invisible not just to the community, but to my own family. Taking this position was a way of reclaiming my identity and ensuring that my experience and knowledge wouldn't go to waste. "Are you angry with us?" Sarah asked quietly. "I'm not angry, but I am disappointed that it took a public revelation for you to see me as someone with valuable skills and insights. I hope that going forward, you'll be more curious about the people in your lives, including the elderly people whose stories and experiences might surprise you." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from media strategy to family dynamics to their own career challenges. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my children as peers rather than as dependents who needed my guidance or protectors who needed to manage my declining capabilities. Monday morning brought my first official day as Director of Strategic Development, and I arrived at the Metro Regional Transportation Headquarters to find my new office already equipped with everything I needed to begin work immediately. James Morrison had assigned me a corner suite with windows overlooking the main bus terminal, symbolically connecting my workspace to the operational reality of the system I would be helping to expand. My first meeting was with the engineering team responsible for route planning. 5 transportation specialists, 3 of whom were women and 2 of whom appeared to be under 30 years old. They had prepared detailed presentations about traffic patterns, demographic analysis, and infrastructure requirements for the proposed expansion. "Mrs. Patterson," said the lead engineer, a woman named Dr. Amanda Foster, "we're excited to work with you on this project. Your institutional knowledge combined with our technical expertise should produce excellent results." I appreciated her respectful but collegial tone. She was treating me as an experienced professional, rather than either a figurehead or a relic from an earlier era of the industry. "Dr. Foster, I've reviewed your preliminary route proposals, and I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your analysis. I do have some suggestions based on my experience with passenger behavior and community needs." We spent the next 3 hours going through the plans systematically, with me offering insights based on decades of observing how people actually used public transportation systems versus how planners thought they would use them. The engineers listened carefully and asked thoughtful questions, and by the end of the meeting, we had identified several modifications that would significantly improve service quality. "Mrs. Patterson," said one of the younger engineers, "can I ask you something? How did you learn so much about passenger behavior patterns? Did you conduct formal research studies?" "I rode the buses," I said simply. "For 30 years, I made it a practice to ride different routes regularly, to observe how passengers interacted with the system and where the pain points were. You can learn more about transportation by spending a day on Route 15 during rush hour than you can from a month of spreadsheet analysis." The comment generated nods around the room, and I could see that these professionals appreciated practical wisdom that complemented their technical training. My second meeting was with David Chen and 3 other frontline employees who had expressed interest in the professional development program. We met in a small conference room near the operations center, and I could sense their mixture of excitement and nervousness about the opportunity. "Before we discuss specific training components," I said, "I want to hear from each of you about what you see as the biggest challenges facing our system from your perspective as drivers and mechanics." The conversation that followed was more valuable than any consultant's report could have been. They talked about vehicles that broke down frequently due to inadequate maintenance schedules, routes that made no sense from an operational standpoint, passenger service issues that could be resolved with better training and clearer protocols. "David," I said, "you mentioned that some drivers struggle with situations involving passengers who have disabilities or mental health challenges. What kind of additional training would be helpful?" "More hands-on practice with accessibility equipment, definitely. But also education about how to de-escalate tense situations and how to communicate respectfully with people who might be confused or agitated." That's exactly the kind of insight that should be incorporated into system-wide training. You're seeing problems that management might miss because you're dealing directly with passengers every day. By the end of the week, I had met with community groups, reviewed budget projections, toured maintenance facilities, and participated in 3 conference calls with state transportation officials. The work was demanding but energizing, combining strategic thinking with practical problem-solving in ways that reminded me why I had loved building Patterson Transportation decades earlier. Friday evening brought one final surprise. I was reviewing route maps in my home office when the doorbell rang. At the door stood a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a warm smile, carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of flowers. "Mrs. Patterson?" "I'm Helen Chen, David's grandmother and Henry's widow. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." I invited Helen in, delighted to meet the widow of one of my most valued former employees and the grandmother of one of my most promising current ones. "Helen, your husband was a wonderful man and an excellent mechanic. I was so sorry when he passed away." "Thank you. Henry always spoke very highly of you. He said you were the fairest boss he ever had, and that you treated your employees like family." We sat in my living room, sharing stories about Henry and discussing David's career development. Helen was clearly proud of her grandson, but also concerned about his future prospects in an industry that didn't always reward merit and dedication. "Mrs. Patterson, David told me about the program you're developing for drivers who want to advance into management. I want you to know how much that means to our family. Henry always believed that good people should have opportunities to grow, regardless of their educational background. Your grandson has all the qualities I look for in potential leaders. He cares about passengers, he understands operational challenges, and he's willing to learn. Those characteristics matter more than formal credentials." As Helen prepared to leave, she turned back to me with a question that went to the heart of why this work mattered. "Mrs. Patterson, do you think things are really different now than they were when Henry was working? Do you think people like David have better opportunities than previous generations did?" "I think we're making progress, but we still have work to do. The goal isn't just to create opportunities for individual advancement, but to build systems that recognize and develop talent regardless of where it starts. Your grandson represents the next generation of leadership in this industry, and my job is to ensure that his potential isn't wasted." Later that evening, I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the street where I had lived for 40 years. The same house where I had raised 3 children while building a transportation empire they knew nothing about. The same neighborhood, where I had been just another suburban mother carpooling kids to activities and attending school board meetings. In 2 weeks, my life had transformed completely. Not because I had changed, but because I had finally stopped hiding who I had always been. The woman who had stood at that bus stop during the blizzard, dismissed and invisible, had reclaimed her place in the world not through anger or resentment, but through quiet competence and unwavering commitment to serving others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, budget hearings and community meetings and engineering reviews, media interviews and stakeholder presentations and strategic planning sessions. The work of building something significant that would outlast any individual leader or administration. But tonight, I was simply Eleanor Chen Patterson, sitting in the home I had bought with the profits from my first successful business venture, planning the next phase of a career that had never really ended, only paused while I focused on being the kind of mother my children needed and the kind of community member my neighbors deserved. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. My daughter's refusal to drive me to a medical appointment had inadvertently led to the revelation that would transform not just my own life, but the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who depended on public transportation throughout Western Pennsylvania. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the smallest steps. Sometimes the people you underestimate are exactly the ones you need to pay attention to. And sometimes, just sometimes, taking the bus can change everything. Up next, you've Got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.